One of the scariest things about birth is thinking about going to the place that you don't want to go, which for most of us is a C-section. The more moms I talk to, the more I realize that C-section is probably one of the largest fears about giving birth because there's so many unknowns. And coming from the place of a mama who had an emergency C-section, I completely understand that level of fear. However, what I've learned since having my C-section is that it was pretty much avoidable if I actually knew what I needed to know going into birth. And so in this video, I want to share with you 5 tips from a C-section mama that you should know so that you can avoid a C-section at all costs. And if you do end up in that situation, how to know if this is a medically necessary decision. Hey mama, welcome back to my channel. My name is Chanel. I am a wife, a mama of 3, soon to be 4, a doula, and this channel is truly dedicated to helping you overcome some of the fears and the unknowns and help you really walk into birth feeling confident and prepared and knowledgeable so that you can be excited to have a beautiful, positive, and fearless birth. So if that sounds like something that you're interested in, make sure to subscribe down below and join our family. I share all about my own experiences, tips from a doula's lens, and making sure that you're prepared not only for birth but motherhood. So if this is your first time on my channel and you have not actually heard about my previous 3 birth stories, I will link them down below so that you can kind of understand. Just for a quick high-level overview of why this topic is so important to me, it is because in my first birth, I went into birth wanting to have an unmedicated hospital birth. I knew that I was strong, I knew that I was confident, and I felt like I had done all of my research, looking at blogs, watching videos online, going to my hospital birth class. But once I got into that moment, I realized very quickly that I actually was not prepared for anything other than my perfect birth scenario. And while that was great and I knew how to breathe and I knew that I was supposed to move around, I actually had no idea how to avoid a C-section because I told myself there's no way I'm having a C-section. And of course, that worst fear of mine came true simply because I didn't know what I didn't know. I didn't know if this C-section was actually necessary. And when my baby's life or even my safety was threatened, of course, I chose the option to do whatever needed to be done to help my baby come to this earth safely and to keep me safe. And while that is a decision that most of us probably will all make, I learned way after the fact that so much of what I experienced was avoidable, it was preventable, and it was not medically necessary. And had I known then what I know now, I probably wouldn't have had that C-section. And as much as it was painful for me, as much birth trauma that it caused me, and as much as it really was difficult to even think about wanting to have more kids after that situation, I am grateful that I went through it, because without that situation, you wouldn't be hearing from me today. Because I've seen what birth trauma can look like. I've seen what a C-section can feel like. And I've also seen the other side of having an unmedicated out of hospital birth where I've trusted my body more than ever. And I've learned through these experiences how to trust my body. And so I want to share that with all of you all so that you feel confident, that you feel educated, that you know that if you do end up in a C-section situation, it was because it was truly the best thing for you and for your baby, and that you made the executive decision for that outcome, not because somebody forced you, coerced you, made you afraid into making a decision that could have just been for the convenience of them. So I want to talk about that through these 5 tips today, and also just share my personal story so that you understand where I'm coming from. Not just because I don't want you to have a C-section, but it's because I've been there before. And if you can avoid that, you should. It's not the easier way out. It takes way more recovery time. It actually causes a lot more mental and emotional trauma than most people will give it credit for. And it's just really not the easy way out. So let's talk about 5 ways to avoid it and how you can know if a C-section is actually necessary for you in birth. Now, the first tip that I have for you to avoid a C-section is to avoid inductions. When you begin to introduce interventions into your birth from the very beginning, it can cause the labor process to be a lot harder. Inductions are sometimes necessary, but in many cases, they're not. especially when it comes to due dates, inductions, arrive steady, all the things that you may have heard about, doctors not wanting you to go past 39 or 40 weeks. Allow your baby to choose their birthday, because if they can, this process will probably go a lot smoother. When we start to interfere or force baby to come out, if there's not a medical reason to, it can cause things to be a lot more difficult. It can cause things to be more painful, and it can cause your baby to go into distress a lot faster because we're actually forcing them out and they haven't shown us that they're actually ready to be here. So when we think about inductions, it's really important to ask yourself and your provider a few questions. What is the reason for induction? Is my baby safe? Are my baby's heart tones good? Are my vitals good? And if the answers to those questions are yes, your baby is safe, your baby sounds and looks great, your vitals are good, you look great, we haven't seen any signs of any complications, and the only reason that we're probably even encouraging induction is because of your due date, then you should really strongly consider whether this is something that you actually want to move forward with. I hear a lot of moms say, well, I just put the date on the calendar because my provider wanted to make sure that I have an induction date just so they can deliver my baby. And like, that's all good and well. However, if that is not a date that is after 41 weeks, you might want to consider waiting a little bit longer, because most first-time mamas will go past their due dates. The average first-time mama will go to 40 plus 5. So if we would just allow our bodies to do what they already know how to do and be a little bit more patient with the birthing process, then we can probably avoid even increasing our risk of a C-section by introducing interventions from the very beginning. Tip number 2 in avoiding a C-section is avoiding medication. Now, I know this is obviously a personal preference, but what you will get a lot on this channel is a lot of natural birthing information and education and knowledge, because what I have seen and experienced is that once you start to introduce interventions, that could be induction, that could be some sort of medication, that can be an epidural, that can be IV pain meds, that could be anything, Pitocin, to try to speed the labor process up, you begin to open the door to a cascade of interventions. And what that can do is it can cause your baby to react in a way that is not necessarily ideal. So when we start to introduce things that don't support the natural birthing process, we tend to see some babies experience fetal distress. If you start to introduce an epidural, sometimes your baby doesn't respond well to that. That is exactly what happened to my baby. My baby was used to me moving around. I was very active in my pregnancy. I was even very active in my labor up until the point that I decided to get an epidural with my first baby. Well, what happened for him was I went from going from this active place, babies moving around, which is extremely beneficial in labor, and also really helpful to avoid a C-section, which we'll talk about in a second. But he went from movement to stagnancy and just being still in a position that he was actually not comfortable in. And so we did see heart tones drop in labor while I was in certain positions because I could not control the movement of my own body anymore. And so introducing medication, introducing other forms of induction like Pitocin to speed up the labor process can put a lot of strain and stress on your baby. And when you do start to see those cascade of interventions, the conversation of C-section tends to come up a lot faster because, well, if we see any little bit of thing that could mean that your baby is not happy, sometimes C-section is like the next step that some providers tend to go to rather than trying to troubleshoot whatever your baby could be in distress about. Just because your baby's heart rate dips does not necessarily mean you have to have a C-section. It could mean baby doesn't like that position. Baby doesn't like you on that side. Baby is communicating that you are dehydrated and you need to hydrate, or you need an IV of saline. Like, it could mean things that have very simple solutions. However, C-sections tend to get brought up a lot faster because at that point, you've already introduced so many things into your body and now we're trying to rush the baby out. So it is really important to try to avoid medication as much as possible and to introduce those things slowly to make sure that you understand how to have a natural birth, how you understand how to stay comfortable without needing medication, to understand all the comfort measures that you have available to you, how your partner can keep you comfortable, what other options that you have other than pain relief medication. Are there natural options that you have? If you can introduce those first, you can probably get through most of your labor without needing any sort of medication. And if you do have medication for whatever reason, understand the benefits and the risks of those medications before you make that decision. Asking the right questions to your provider or to your nurses, actually getting educated about those options before you go into labor so that you can know what you're saying yes to or what you're saying no to and what might be the best option for you. Tip number 3 to avoiding a C-section is not rushing to the hospital. I have an entire video on this on when to know to go to the hospital, so you can check that out here. I'll also link it down below. But one of the biggest things that you can do to avoid a C-section is to avoid being at the hospital too soon, because just like we talked about before, you don't want to interfere with the natural birthing process, whether it be trying to speed the labor process up, trying to start the labor process in a way that is not actually spontaneous and not as natural to your body, introducing medication to either cause you not to be able to move, or just introducing things that we don't know how your baby will react. But those things tend to happen if you're at the hospital right away or too soon, because if you are at the hospital really early in your labor process and you do plan on having an unmedicated or natural birth, well, those interventions can start to be introduced or suggested to you a lot sooner to get this process going. And if you have learned anything about natural birth, either from this page or anywhere else, you know that labor can take some time. We do not need to speed up the process. We don't need to rush the process. And so it's important to labor at home as long as possible. Obviously, we want to take a lot of things into consideration, which is why that video about knowing when to go to the hospital is going to be extremely crucial for you. But know how to labor at home as long as possible, and at what point it's necessary for you to start heading into the hospital, so that when you get there, hopefully you don't have to labor there for too long, but then also you're far enough into the process of labor, active labor, that we don't really need something to speed up the process. Hopefully we've stayed comfortable enough and we found the things that have worked for us so that we can continue that in the hospital and don't need any sort of medication for support. So staying at home as long as possible, avoiding any unnecessary interventions, and then also avoiding being in a hospital space that can be very distracting. It can be very cold. It can be very unfamiliar. And sometimes when we enter into a hospital space after being at home, either too early or because we feel like we'll be safer in a hospital and would rather labor there longer, it can change the process of labor. It can slow things down. It could even cause things to stall. Or because we have so many people coming in and out of the room every 15 to 20 minutes, it can also cause you to feel a little bit more overwhelmed, a little bit more stressed. That can cause your blood pressure to shoot through the roof. And now we're actually being strongly suggested to introduce these interventions, which push us down the road of cascade of interventions. And that leads us even closer to a C-section. So if you haven't picked this up by now, avoiding anything that's going to distract, interrupt, rush this entire birthing process or your birth zone is not ideal if you want to avoid a C-section. Tip number 4 to avoid a C-section is something that I mentioned earlier, which is to be moving around, staying active. And this is both in your pregnancy and in your labor process. Movement is so key to helping your baby get into an optimal position, helping your body prepare and have endurance and stamina for labor, but then also to help your baby descend into the pelvis and then out through your body and your birth canal. Movement is a comfort measure. Movement is what helps your baby move in position before labor, in labor. You have the flexibility to move your pelvis in different directions for different parts of labor. If you haven't checked out my station series, I highly suggest doing that, so you understand what I'm actually talking about and how to move and when to move at particular parts in your labor. But movement is key. And if you have medication, it's unlikely that you're going to be able to move, especially if you get the epidural. If you are not active in your pregnancy, it's unlikely that your body is going to want to respond to being active in labor. And if you're not moving in labor, then your body's probably going to experience a lot more pain and be a lot more uncomfortable because you're sitting in one place. You're most likely going to be tensing up and bracing yourself and fighting through each contraction rather than embracing it and moving through it literally. So staying active will help your baby move through your body appropriately, allow them to have different things to support the descent of them into your pelvis, and that can help your baby actually move from a negative station to a positive station and allow you to use gravity or any other potential position to push and avoid a lot of the things that we're afraid of, which is pushing for too long, tearing while we're pushing, birth being really painful. Movement is a key for all of those things. So it's important that you learn how to stay active, because if we can do those things, we can avoid potential complications in labor, which obviously could lead us down the road of a C-section. And tip number 5 to avoiding a C-section, which honestly is the most important in my opinion, is understanding and getting educated about the birthing process. None of those 4 things that we just talked about are actually going to be possible for you if you don't understand the birthing process. And when I say you, I mean you and your partner or your support person, whoever is going to be in the room with you. If y'all don't know the birthing process, if you don't know what happens during early labor, if you don't know what happens during active labor, if you don't know when you're supposed to go to the hospital, if you don't understand what interventions could be introduced to you, when you would want to use those, when you would want to avoid those, when a C-section is medically necessary and when it's not, how your partner is going to keep you comfortable. Like if you don't understand those things and your partner doesn't understand those at the same level as you, this whole process is going to be a lot more difficult. And that was me the first time around. I thought going to a hospital birth class for 2 hours and reading the What to Expect When Expecting book was giving me all that I needed. Following a few pages on social media was getting me as educated as I needed to be, because I trusted my body and I felt like I was strong. And those things are still important. And I was actually not being prepared from a source who was actually going to give me all of the things that my hospital wasn't going to tell me. That when I got into the hospital, a lot of the things that they told me in those birth classes actually didn't even become true. I didn't know that I shouldn't go to the hospital because my water broke. I didn't know a lot of those things because my hospital birth class was not teaching those things to me. Those are things that if you don't understand the birthing process, you're not going to understand how to trust your body more than you trust a provider. And hopefully you can have a provider who aligns with you trusting your body and we follow you from that process. But if we're being real, that's just not the reality for most women. And so I encourage you, strongly encourage you to make sure that you are finding some sort of source, reliable source. That could be a doula, that could be a birthing class at a birth center, that could be something in your community that educates you on the overall process. And if I'm being honest, it's not going to happen in 2 hours. You're not going to get everything that you need in 2 hours because there's so much to learn when it comes to advocacy, knowing how to ask the right questions, knowing how to move your body, knowing how to breathe, knowing how to avoid interventions, knowing how not to rush to the hospital. Like there's so many things that you need to understand so that when you actually are in labor on the day of, you don't have to freak out because you don't know what's coming at you. Or if somebody's suggesting something to you that you're not unaware or hearing it for the first time. And so that you can stay in your birth zone and that your partner can actually speak up for you, because that's really their job in labor, is to keep you comfortable and to use their voice to speak up and answer questions. But if they don't know what they're talking about, if they don't know what the doctor is talking about, and they want to ask you for the answers, like now you're thrown off and they are relying on you for the source of information. They're actually not exercising their role as your birth partner and support person how they should be. And so that is honestly why I created my Work Your Birth program, is because if I would have been given all of the knowledge and tools that I had for my second and my third birth while I was pregnant with my first, I could have avoided my entire situation of a C-section. But I got scared. My husband got scared because we thought this person, this provider, they know what we want. They know we want the natural birth. But if they're suggesting a C-section, like it must be necessary. And for a lot of us, 50% of us, it's actually not necessary. necessary. Statistically speaking, 50% of us actually don't need the C-sections that we're actually being suggested. But if you don't know that, you don't know how to avoid that, then you can easily become one of the statistics of why in the United States, C-sections are so common, especially for women of color. So I plead and really urge you to get educated from a reliable source. You can check out my Work Your Birth program below, where I actually coach you and your partner, and my husband is involved with this process too, so that you're prepared for your role, mama, and your partner is prepared for their role, so that you can do this together in a place of fearlessness, in a place of the knowledge, in a place of feeling empowered. And if you schedule a call down below, we'll talk through your birth goals and if this program is a good fit for you. If you want to have the support of a doula along your journey in your pregnancy, that is what this program is for. And although I had a doula in my second and my third pregnancies, had I known this information, I am so confident that my husband and I would have been able to do it by ourselves the first time around. And 95% of my clients are the same exact way. They do it themselves because they have the knowledge and the know-how to do it. So if that sounds like something you're interested in, make sure that you check out that program below and schedule a free 45-minute consultation where we will talk through all of your goals. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we end this video is, how do we know if a C-section is actually medically necessary? A lot of the most common reasons that C-sections are suggested is because your baby might be breech, you are experiencing some fetal distress, maybe your water has been broken for too long, maybe you have been pushing for too long, or maybe you're failing to progress. All of those things are some of the most overused explanations or reasons to suggest a C-section. And in some of those cases, those might be medically necessary, but in most of them, they're not. One of the things that is important to understand when you are deciding whether a C-section is necessary is if you have exhausted all of your options. When it comes to a baby experiencing fetal distress and heart rate dips, it is important to understand how long that's been happening and have we actually done anything to help baby's heart rate come back up to normal rates. Are we changing positions? Is mom hydrated? Are we actually close to pushing? Because sometimes when we're close to pushing, your baby's heart rate will dip and come back up. Is your baby's heart rate coming back up? And like, what is your baby's heart rate? So many of those questions are not asked and moms are not educated on those kinds of things. So how would we know if a C-section is necessary? If any first-time mama, or any mama in that matter, is being told their baby's heart rate is dipping, of course that's scary. Of course we want to hurry up and think about getting our baby out as soon as possible. And for some moms, that is the case and that is medically necessary. But if we're being real, that was the excuse that I was given, and my baby just didn't like one side that I was on. And I got nervous because I didn't realize, like, well, maybe my baby just doesn't like my left side. And maybe I just need to suggest to stay on my right side. Like, I just didn't know those things. And so I think it's important to understand that. Another reason that a C-section is often suggested is if a baby is breech. That is not a medically necessary reason to have a C-section. However, if your provider is not skilled and trained in delivering breech babies, then you will be suggested and strongly encouraged to have a C-section. So it is important to understand very early on, if your baby is breech, will your provider deliver that baby? Because there are some providers who will and there are some providers who won't. Some things that do require a C-section could be placenta previa. Your placenta is covering your cervix. You cannot deliver a baby vaginally. If your baby is transverse just means your baby is literally horizontal in your belly. If your baby is in the position of transverse at the time of birth, you cannot deliver a baby vaginally that way. There are things that you can do leading up to that, but you cannot deliver a baby vaginally that way. If you have HIV, you probably are not going to be delivering a baby vaginally because you don't want to pass that on through the birth canal to your baby. If you have herpes and you have an active outbreak at the time of labor, you probably are going to be suggested to have a C-section. This is also a medically necessary reason to have a C-section, simply because if your baby goes through the birth canal at the time that you have a breakout of having herpes, your baby could contract herpes as well. And so a C-section is a more medically safe way to deliver your baby to avoid passing that on to them. And another medically necessary reason to have a C-section is if you experience cord prolapse. That just means that the umbilical cord actually comes out or tries to come out before the baby. That is an actual medical emergency. Baby's cord cannot come out before the baby. That is their life source, and we cannot have that being delivered from your body before the actual baby is. So if you happen to feel a cord, or if your provider feels a cord, or your nurse feels a cord before they feel a baby, that is a medically necessary reason for a C-section. It doesn't happen very often, so this is a rare occurrence, but it is important that you understand that going into labor so that you don't mistake that for not being a big deal, because that is something that is actually very serious and for you to be aware of when you go into labor. Okay, that was a lot of information because I try to pack as much as I can into these videos, but I hope that it was helpful. If you did find this helpful, make sure to hit that thumbs up button. If you have any questions over anything that I've said, make sure to drop those in the comments below. And if you've had a C-section before and you have things that you wish that you would have known that first time around or that second time around, and you think that would be helpful for another mama, make sure to put that in the comments below, because it's important that we are empowering each other in this community and that we are sharing tips that have been helpful for us. Obviously, you know I probably have a lot more than I shared today, but to keep this video as short as possible, I wanted to give you my 5 most important tips that I have been able to teach and utilize for myself to avoid any unnecessary C-section for any potential future births.